Imagine a king, adorned in the richest silks and velvets, commanding armies and a nation, who suddenly, inexplicably, believes his very body is made of brittle glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. For 30 years, this was the terrifying reality of Charles VI of France, a monarch whose mind fractured under the weight of his crown, plunging an entire kingdom into a nightmare of delusion and civil war. If the harrowing descent into madness of a powerful ruler stirs your intrigue, then consider this your invitation to delve deeper into history's most unsettling narratives. Subscribe to our channel, share your thoughts below, and let us know where in the world you are experiencing these echoes from the past. Born in 1368, Charles VI ascended to the French throne at the tender age of 11, inheriting a kingdom ravaged by the 100 Years' War and the recent Black Death. His early years, however, seemed to promise a golden age. He was charismatic, athletic, and possessed a quick wit, quickly earning him the moniker Charles the Beloved or Charles the Fair. Imagine the bustling, vibrant court of a young king, full of tournaments, lavish feasts, and ambitious plans to restore France to its former glory. Initially, his regents, a council dominated by his powerful uncles, held the reins of power. But by 1388, at the age of 20, Charles confidently dismissed them, declaring his full intention to rule independently. He surrounded himself with a new generation of advisors, often called the marmozets, who were keen on reform and peace, moving away from the costly wars of his predecessors. He negotiated a 3-year truce with England, a desperately needed respite, and began to address the crushing burden of taxation on his people. There was a palpable sense of hope across France. Their young king seemed to embody all the virtues of chivalry and enlightened leadership. His marriage to Isabeau of Bavaria, a beautiful and spirited queen, further cemented the image of a flourishing monarchy, producing a burgeoning family that secured the dynastic future. These were years of genuine promise, a period where the seeds of recovery were sown, and the young king appeared destined to be one of France's most successful rulers. The brutal scars of the previous decades seemed to be healing under his benevolent, if youthful, command. The future of France, in Charles's early years, glittered with the prospect of peace and renewed prosperity, all guided by a king who, by all accounts, was physically robust and mentally sound. The year is 1392. France, under Charles's renewed vigor and the progressive policies of his marmozet advisors, was still grappling with persistent internal strife, a lingering consequence of decades of war and fractured loyalties. The most pressing concern at this moment was the recalcitrant Duke of Brittany, Jean IV, a powerful vassal whose allegiance often wavered precariously between the French crown and its English adversaries. The Duke had recently offered sanctuary to a particularly egregious offender, Pierre de Craon, a disaffected nobleman who, in a brazen act of defiance against royal authority and a profound personal affront to the king, had orchestrated the attempted assassination of Olivier de Clisson. Clisson, the Constable of France, was not merely a military commander. He was a trusted friend, a confidant, and a cornerstone of Charles's new administration, embodying the very ideals of reform and loyalty that the young king sought to champion. Charles, barely 4 years into his independent rule, was incensed by this blatant challenge to his sovereignty and the heinous attack on a man he held in high esteem. His initial reaction was one of fierce, righteous indignation. This was not merely a political grievance. It was a profound personal betrayal that threatened to undermine the very foundations of his reign. He vowed swift and decisive revenge, determined to bring the audacious Duke of Brittany, and by extension, Pierre de Craon, to justice. The king's decision was firm. He would lead his army himself, a clear declaration of his strength and commitment to asserting royal authority across his kingdom. And so, in the sweltering heat of August 1392, a vast royal army assembled. The heavy woolen tunics, the glint of polished steel armor, the rhythmic thud of thousands of marching boots, and the creak of supply wagons filled the air with a sense of martial purpose, but also an oppressive weight. It was a scorching August day, the sun beating down mercilessly from a cloudless sky, baking the earth and turning the air thick with dust kicked up by the marching columns. The journey was arduous, stretching for days across the vast, undulating landscapes of northern France. The oppressive heat, combined with the sheer physical exertion of the march, the heavy armor, and the constant pressure of command, began to take a subtle but significant toll on everyone, including the young king. Charles, usually so robust and energetic, found himself increasingly irritable, perhaps even plagued by a growing sense of unease, a latent predisposition exacerbated by the relentless strain. The sheer physical discomfort was immense. Men and horses alike were exhausted, parched, their spirits dampened by the relentless sun and the seemingly endless road. As the royal party traversed the dense ancient forest of Le Mans, a place of deep shadows and sudden, sun-dappled clearings, the atmosphere seemed to shift, growing heavier, more charged. It was a place where local folklore and ancient fears lingered. Suddenly, dramatically, a wild, unkempt man, dressed in little more than tattered rags, burst forth from the deep cover of the trees. His eyes were wide and frantic, his hair matted, his whole demeanor that of a tormented soul. With terrifying speed, he lunged towards the king's horse, seizing its bridle with a surprisingly strong grip and screaming, his voice raw and piercing, "Ride no further, noble king! You are betrayed!" The shrill, fervent warning cut through the heavy air, momentarily stunning the entire retinue. The king's guards, shocked into action, quickly drove the man away, pushing him back into the shadows from whence he came. Yet the encounter, bizarre and unsettling as it was, left an indelible mark. The man's words, his frantic delivery, resonated deeply with Charles. Was he merely a madman or a harbinger of some darker truth? In a superstitious age, such an encounter was often interpreted as an ill omen, a divine warning. The incident, combined with the relentless, debilitating heat, the cumulative stress of the arduous campaign, and perhaps an underlying psychological vulnerability that had lain dormant, seemed to snap something fundamental within Charles's mind. His agitation, already palpable, intensified. His mind, already weary and strained, was now gripped by an inexplicable paranoia, his thoughts racing, disordered. Moments later, as the procession continued, the silence of the forest was violently shattered. One of his pages, perhaps clumsy with fatigue or nervous from the earlier encounter, accidentally dropped a steel lance. It struck the ground with a deafening clatter, a harsh, metallic shriek that echoed through the trees. The sound, amplified not only by the sudden quiet, but by the king's hyper-agitated, overwrought state, proved to be the final, terrifying trigger. In an instant, the gentle, charismatic Charles the Beloved vanished. His eyes, moments before merely troubled, now blazed with an unfathomable, terrifying fury. He drew his sword with a frantic, desperate urgency, the blade flashing in the dappled sunlight. "Forward! Upon the traitors!" he screamed, his voice no longer that of a king, but of a man consumed by an unseen torment. He began to indiscriminately attack his own retinue, slashing wildly, without recognition or mercy, at his loyal knights, trusted advisors, and terrified pages. The chaos was immediate and absolute. Men who had served him for years, who adored him, found themselves recoiling in horror as their king, their sovereign, became a terrifying, unpredictable force of destruction. Horses reared, men shouted in disbelief and fear, the air filled with the clang of steel on steel as knights frantically tried to parry their monarch's frenzied blows without actually harming him. Several men, caught off guard by the sudden, insane assault, were tragically wounded or killed, their loyal service ending brutally by the hand of the very king they had sworn to protect. The bewildering attack continued for several terrifying minutes before his courtiers, a mixture of seasoned warriors and younger nobles, managed to subdue him. It was a desperate, impossible task. How does one grapple with a maddened king without committing an act of treason? With immense difficulty and profound sorrow, they managed to wrestle him to the ground, his powerful body writhing in a furious struggle, and disarm him. He fought with the strength of a possessed man, his screams echoing through the forest until, finally, utterly exhausted, he collapsed. They laid him on a hastily arranged litter, his body racked with violent convulsions, his mind lost in a world of its own, seemingly unconscious. The expedition, conceived in vigor and righteousness, was immediately and ignominiously abandoned. The sight of their king, once the epitome of strength and chivalry, now a convulsing, insensate figure, sent a wave of shock, fear, and profound despondency through the entire army. There was no question of continuing. The king was rushed back to Paris, a changed man. His return journey a somber, desperate procession instead of a triumphant march. The physicians of the court, summoned immediately, were baffled, offering theories ranging from humors out of balance to divine displeasure, even suggesting sorcery or demonic possession, for they had no understanding of such a profound mental affliction. This horrifying incident in the forest of Le Mans was the first, undeniable manifestation of the severe mental illness that would plague Charles for the rest of his life. It was a chilling harbinger, the spark of madness that ignited a devastating fire within him, and with him, engulfed the stability of France. The shock to his court was immense. Their beloved king, the embodiment of chivalry, grace, and enlightened leadership, had become a terrifying, unpredictable force, a man possessed by some unknown, malevolent spirit. The incident wasn't just a moment of profound personal tragedy for Charles. It was the opening act in a national drama of decline, sowing deep seeds of fear, uncertainty, and political instability that would grow into a bitter harvest of civil conflict and dynastic struggle. The promising era of Charles the Beloved had abruptly ended, replaced by the ominous reign of a king whose mind was irrevocably shattered, leaving France to grapple with the terrifying implications of a monarch lost to madness. The period following the Forest of Le Mans incident saw Charles VI's mental state oscillate wildly, an unpredictable pendulum swinging between frightening episodes of delusion and periods of heartbreaking clarity. There were blessed respites of lucidity, sometimes lasting months, during which he would regain his faculties, express profound remorse for his earlier actions, and earnestly attempt to resume his duties as sovereign. During these precious intervals, he would sign decrees, preside over councils, and even engage in hunting, his court breathing a collective sigh of relief, clinging to the hope that the nightmare was finally over. But these fragile lulls were always, inevitably, followed by terrifying relapses, sudden descents back into a world of paranoia and hallucination. His madness was not a constant, unwavering state, but a tormenting cycle of lucidity and profound delusion, a cruel psychological ebb and flow that made consistent governance a precarious and often impossible task. The court, and indeed the kingdom, lived in a perpetual state of anxious anticipation, never knowing which version of their king would greet them from one day to the next, fostering an atmosphere of profound uncertainty and quiet dread. One of the most infamous and brutally revealing episodes of his illness occurred in 1393, just a year after his first major breakdown, and tragically solidified the public's understanding of their king's increasingly fragile mind. It was a masquerade ball, known to history as the Bal des Ardents, or Ball of the Burning Men, a lavish affair held in the Hôtel Saint-Paul to celebrate the marriage of a lady-in-waiting to Queen Isabeau. The king, perhaps seeking a distraction from the lingering anxieties of his recent illness, or simply indulging in the era's taste for extravagant spectacle, decided to participate in a particularly perilous prank. Along with 5 of his closest nobles, prominent figures like Hugues de Guise and Yvain de Foix, Charles chose to dress as wild men of the woods, a popular medieval archetype representing primeval savagery and untamed nature. Their costumes were a dangerous concoction: tight-fitting linen garments, painstakingly soaked in resin, and then generously coated with sticky flax fibers, making them terrifyingly flammable. Imagine the scene: a grand, dimly lit hall, usually opulent, but now transformed by the flickering light of torches and candles. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, perfumed oils, and the excited chatter of the assembled nobility, all eagerly awaiting the next spectacle. Suddenly, 6 figures emerged, grotesque and unrecognizable under their bizarre, shaggy disguises, their faces obscured by grotesque masks, and their bodies appearing almost bestial. To heighten the dramatic effect and ensure they remained together, they were chained, one to another, a single, swaying mass of wild men. They began to dance wildly, leaping and cavorting with abandon, their strange forms casting elongated, dancing shadows on the walls, eliciting gasps and amused murmurs from the court. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, a playful tension hanging heavy in the air. However, the revelry quickly turned to unimaginable horror. Charles's younger brother, the charismatic and often reckless Louis, Duke of Orléans, arrived late to the festivities. Perhaps having consumed too much wine, or simply driven by a youthful curiosity, he strode into the hall with a lit torch, eager to identify the mysterious dancers. Approaching too closely, a fatal misstep in the crowded hall, he leaned in for a better look. A spark, a tiny ember from his torch, detached itself, a silent, deadly projectile in the smoky air. In an instant, it landed on one of the highly flammable costumes. A sudden whoosh, a flash of orange, and the flaxen disguises ignited with terrifying speed, engulfing 4 of the 6 wild men in an inferno. Their joyous shouts morphed into piercing, agonizing screams of terror and pain, cutting through the festive atmosphere like a jagged knife. The hall erupted into chaos. Noblewomen fainted, courtiers scrambled back in horror, and the air filled with the sickening smell of burning flesh. The scene was one of unimaginable horror and confusion. 4 men, including Hugues de Guise, who had suggested the prank, were instantly consumed by flames, their final moments a horrific public spectacle. Charles himself was saved only by an extraordinary stroke of luck and the quick thinking of his aunt, the Duchess of Berry. Recognizing her nephew despite his disguise, she reacted with astonishing presence of mind, throwing her voluminous skirt and cloak over him, shielding him from the inferno and smothering the nascent flames that had just begun to lick at his own costume. She held him tightly, pressing him to her, as the screams and terror continued around them. The traumatic event, witnessing such a brutal and sudden tragedy, irrevocably shattered what little mental stability Charles had regained. It sent him plunging into another prolonged and profound fit of madness, one that would deepen his existing psychological vulnerabilities and manifest in even stranger ways. During this relapse, his delusions began to take on a more defined and chilling form, becoming less generalized agitation and more specific, debilitating beliefs. He completely forgot his name, believing he was no longer Charles, but some other identity. He rejected his wife, Queen Isabeau, and his own children, unable to recognize them as his family, often treating them as strangers or even enemies. He would frequently run wild through the palace, his frightened servants unable to control him, convinced he was not the king and that he needed to escape some unseen threat. Most famously, his mind seized upon the terrifying notion that his entire body, or specific parts of it, were made of fragile glass. This glass delusion, known to psychiatry as porphyrophobia, though rare, became one of his most persistent and well-known symptoms. He would issue bizarre commands to his servants and courtiers, insisting they not touch him, or that they move very slowly and cautiously around him, fearing that any sudden jostle or careless touch would cause him to shatter into 1,000 pieces. He often wrapped himself in thick blankets or layers of padding, even in the stifling heat of summer, believing these cocoon-like coverings would protect his incredibly delicate glass body. For months on end, he would refuse to change his clothes, convinced that the simple act of undressing and redressing would risk breaking his fragile form. He also exhibited periods of intense paranoia, convinced he was being conspired against by those closest to him. His trust utterly eroded. At other times, he would declare with unwavering conviction that he was Saint George, destined to fight dragons and cleanse the world of evil, a fantastical escape from his royal burdens. The Bal des Ardents was not merely a tragic accident. It became a profoundly symbolic event. It was a moment where the court and, by extension, the kingdom, witnessed firsthand the terrifying precariousness of their sovereign's sanity. It became a public spectacle that underscored the escalating instability at the very heart of the French monarchy, transforming Charles from the beloved into the mad. With a king who truly believed he was made of glass, a monarch who could shatter at any moment, the governance of France itself seemed equally fragile, poised on the precipice of a terrifying unknown. With Charles VI incapacitated for extended periods, his mind often lost in a fog of delusion or battling the anxieties of fleeting lucidity, the effective governance of France inevitably fell into a chaotic power vacuum. The kingdom, needing a firm hand on the tiller, instead found itself dangerously adrift. The king's recurring madness meant that for decades, the realm lacked a stable, authoritative head, becoming a chessboard for ambitious dukes and princes to maneuver for influence and control over the fragile machinery of the state. The most prominent contenders for this de facto regency were Charles's younger brother, Louis, Duke of Orléans, and his powerful uncle, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Louis of Orléans was a man of refined tastes and intellect, known for his charm, patronage of the arts, and a keen political mind that quickly made him the de facto ruler during the king's many incapacitations. He favored a more centralized monarchy and an ambitious foreign policy, not shy about enriching himself and his supporters from the royal coffers. John the Fearless, by contrast, was a formidable and often ruthless figure, inheriting not only vast territories in Burgundy and Flanders, but also immense personal wealth and a fiercely loyal network of vassals. His vision was more focused on consolidating his own powerful state within the French kingdom, and he deeply resented Orléans' influence and perceived extravagance. The two men represented fundamentally opposing approaches to governance, one seeking a grander, more international Valois court, the other prioritizing territorial power for the great magnates, and were locked in a venomous personal and political struggle that poisoned the very atmosphere of the court. Their rivalry was not merely about personal power or the distribution of lucrative offices. It was about the fundamental direction of the kingdom, control over the ailing king's person, and the substantial revenues of France, which were constantly being siphoned off by one faction or another. Charles, during his brief and precious intervals of lucidity, would attempt to mediate between his brother and his uncle, often arranging theatrical reconciliations and pleading with them to put aside their animosity for the good of France. But his periods of mental clarity were too brief, and his royal authority too eroded to enforce any lasting peace or prevent the resurgence of their bitter antagonism. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria found herself caught in the treacherous currents of this struggle, navigating court politics with a mad husband and warring in-laws. Accused by some of an illicit affair with Louis of Orleans, and by others of neglect towards her insane husband, she became a controversial figure, often aligning herself with whichever faction offered her and her children the most security and influence. Her political maneuvering, while perhaps pragmatic and born of a desperate need to survive, further alienated different factions and fueled public discontent, especially as she was seen to profit alongside Orleans from the royal treasury. The animosity between Orleans and Burgundy, festering for years through courtly squabbles, public accusations, and political maneuvering, finally exploded. Tensions reached a breaking point, fueled by accusations of financial corruption against Orleans and Burgundy's impatience with his perceived tyranny. On the frigid night of November 23, 1407, John the Fearless orchestrated the brutal murder of Louis of Orleans on the dark, cobbled streets of Paris. Returning from a visit to Queen Isabeau, Orleans was ambushed by masked assassins who hacked him to death, leaving his mangled body in the gutter. This shocking act of political violence, openly acknowledged and even justified by Burgundy, sent a tremor of horror throughout France, plunging the kingdom into open civil war. This ignited the devastating Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, a conflict that would rage for decades, tearing the very fabric of French society apart. The Armagnacs, loyal to the murdered Duke of Orleans, and later led by Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, battled the Burgundians, who controlled much of northern France and its wealthiest cities, including Paris, for significant periods. The capital itself became a battleground, suffering sieges, massacres, and constant upheaval, its streets running red with the blood of its citizens. The war was characterized by brutal raids, burning villages, and a complete breakdown of law and order, turning neighbor against neighbor. While the king was often vaguely aware of these horrific events during his lucid intervals, his mental state made him utterly incapable of effective leadership or understanding the full gravity of the unfolding disaster. He was a tragic pawn in their games, his royal seal and decrees often manipulated by whichever faction held temporary sway over his person. Their competing claims to legitimate authority plunged France into constitutional chaos. France, desperate for strong, unified leadership in a time of profound crisis, instead had a king who was a phantom, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in his harrowing glass delusion, and always overshadowed by the relentless machinations of his warring relatives. This protracted internal conflict drained France's resources, exhausted its people, and shattered its military might, leaving it grievously weakened and dangerously vulnerable to its ancient enemy, England, setting the stage for one of the most humiliating chapters in its storied history. As France descended into the self-destructive maelstrom of the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, its old enemy across the Channel watched with predatory interest, a keen hawk eyeing wounded prey. The long-standing 100 Years' War had entered a new, brutal phase, and France's internal strife presented an unparalleled opportunity for England. Under the brilliant, ruthlessly pragmatic King Henry V, a monarch forged in the crucible of his own domestic challenges, England saw not just a chance to reclaim ancestral lands, but a tangible path to seizing the French crown itself, fulfilling centuries of English ambition. In 1415, Henry V launched a devastating invasion of France. Landing with a smaller, highly disciplined army, he pushed deep into French territory, famously culminating in the Battle of Agincourt on October 25th. This catastrophic defeat was not merely a military loss, it was a national trauma. The flower of French chivalry, numerous dukes, counts, thousands of finest knights and men-at-arms, were slaughtered in the mud and rain or captured, utterly shattering French morale and military strength. Agincourt laid bare France's internal weakness and strategic disarray, leaving the kingdom reeling, its once formidable military now a shadow, ripe for the picking by its determined English adversary. The Civil War had drained France of its vitality, resources, and national unity, creating a vacuum Henry V was eager to exploit. The Burgundian faction, led by the astute and deeply vengeful John the Fearless, grew increasingly willing to negotiate and even align with the English. Their hatred for the Armagnacs, whom they blamed for much of France's woes, superseded any sense of national solidarity. For Burgundy, an English alliance was a cynical but strategically sound move to gain a decisive advantage in their internecine struggle, even if it meant sacrificing France's broader interests. The ailing Charles VI, a phantom king amidst his recurring glass delusions and profound confusion, remained the nominal monarch, a tragic figurehead. His royal seal could be coerced, his decrees manipulated, his very person a symbol used by warring factions rather than a source of authoritative leadership. Then, in 1419, another pivotal and profoundly brutal act of political assassination tore through the already fragile political landscape. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, was murdered during a parley with the French Dauphin, Charles's son and heir, Charles, Duke of Touraine, on the bridge at Montereau. This act, whether a premeditated trap or an impulsive, desperate vengeance, had cataclysmic consequences. It solidified beyond all doubt the Burgundian alliance with England, a betrayal of monumental proportions that forever changed the trajectory of the 100 Years' War. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, utterly enraged by his father's murder, viewed the Dauphin as a treacherous regicide. Blinded by grief and an unshakable desire for retribution, Philip saw no hope in reconciliation with the Armagnacs. He swiftly and irrevocably threw his full support behind Henry V of England, pledging his immense resources and vast territories to the English cause. With the crucial Burgundian alliance secured, and Charles VI in a state of profound mental incapacity, the stage was set for the ultimate humiliation of France. In 1420, in a move that has haunted French memory for centuries, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria and Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, negotiated and signed the infamous Treaty of Troyes. This treaty was a diplomatic masterpiece for England and a national disaster for France, effectively dismantling the Valois dynasty. It not only disinherited the legitimate French Dauphin, Charles, declaring him illegitimate in a deeply controversial move, but also arranged for the marriage of Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, to Henry V of England. Most shockingly, it stipulated that upon Charles VI's death, the crown of France would pass directly to Henry V and his heirs, uniting the crowns of England and France under a single English monarch. Imagine the profound psychological and political despair this treaty inflicted upon loyal French subjects, those who still believed in the rightful lineage of their king. Their mad king, or more accurately, the ruthless factions manipulating him, had effectively signed away the sovereignty of France to its greatest enemy, turning their kingdom into an English inheritance. Charles VI, in his fleeting lucid moments, may have grasped the devastating gravity of this pact, the absolute destruction of his dynasty and his nation's independence. But his periods of absence, his deep descents into the glass delusion and profound confusion, meant he often drifted in and out of comprehension, a tragic, helpless bystander to the destruction of his own family's future and the fate of France. He lived for 2 more agonizing years after the signing of the Treaty of Troyes, finally succumbing in 1422. He died a king who had lost his mind, lost control of his kingdom, and through the actions of others, ultimately lost the future of his lineage, all while convinced his fragile body might shatter at any moment. His death, far from bringing peace, merely intensified the struggle, as 2 infant kings were now proclaimed, Henry VI of England and France, and Charles VII of France, the disinherited Dauphin, still fighting for his birthright from the few territories that remained loyal to him. The reign of Charles VI, the king who believed he was made of glass, tragically led to the near shattering of France itself, leaving it fractured and utterly vulnerable. Charles VI died in 1422, a king whose reign became synonymous with tragedy, mental illness, and national catastrophe. His death did not bring an end to the 100 Years' War or France's internal turmoil. Rather, it ushered in a new, even more desperate phase. According to the Treaty of Troyes, the infant Henry VI of England was immediately proclaimed King of France, even being crowned in Paris, the very heart of the kingdom. Meanwhile, Charles VI's disinherited son, the Dauphin, retreated to the loyal territories south of the Loire, a king of Bourges in all but name, fighting a seemingly hopeless battle for his birthright as Charles VII. The years following Charles VI's death were indeed the darkest for France, with English and Burgundian forces controlling vast swaths of the country. It seemed the Glass King's broken mind had indeed presaged the broken state of his kingdom. However, the very depth of this despair also sparked a fierce, nationalistic resistance. The figure of Joan of Arc, who emerged years later, would rally the fragmented French forces, inspire the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, and eventually turn the tide of the 100 Years' War. But the scars of Charles VI's reign ran deep. The madness of the king became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences when the head of state is incapacitated, leading to factionalism, civil war, and foreign domination. Historians and chroniclers of the time struggled to explain his condition, often attributing it to divine punishment, witchcraft, or inherited bad blood. Modern interpretations often point to schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or another form of psychosis, exacerbated by the immense pressures of kingship and the stresses of his era. Regardless of the precise diagnosis, Charles VI's legacy is that of a king whose personal suffering profoundly impacted an entire nation. His mental fragility inadvertently opened the door to the most brutal phase of the 100 Years' War and the bitter Armagnac-Burgundian conflict. France endured decades of instability, suffering, and foreign occupation, all stemming in part from the vacuum created by a king who could not rule, a king trapped within his own shattering mind. His story is a poignant testament to the fragility of both the human mind and the institutions it governs, a chilling illustration of how a single individual's illness can ripple through the fabric of history, leaving an indelible mark on generations to come. The whispers of the Glass King would echo for centuries, a tragic prelude to a new era for France, forged in the crucible of his shattered reign. The tragic reign of Charles VI, the king who believed he was made of glass, serves as a haunting historical testament to the profound link between a ruler's mental state and the fate of their nation. His story, a tapestry woven with personal torment and national upheaval, reveals how deeply psychological fragility can impact the course of history, and reminds us of the precarious balance between power and sanity. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of one of France's most unfortunate monarchs. Until our next journey into the annals of the past, stay curious and continue to seek the truths hidden within history's shadows.